Hey, welcome back to Dumph. My name's Harrison and this is the Nokia 6300 4G. The Nokia 6300 4G is a pretty interesting phone. It was released at the start of 2021 and it's available both in the US and internationally for around $70. This video is all about my first impressions using this phone. I've been using it for about a week and I'm going to do a full review once I've spent a bit more time with it. Let's jump straight in though, starting with an unboxing of this phone. Inside the box you can see we've got the phone itself up top. Then underneath, we've got the removable 1500 mAh battery. Tucked away, we've also got a pair of headphones and the micro USB charging brick. Before we go any further, I'll just pop off the back of this phone and insert the battery, which is nice and easy to do. This phone itself is pretty simple. Up top, we've got the power button and headphone jack, and on the front, a very average 2.4-inch display. Not that I'm expecting anything more from such a budget device. We've also got the keypad and face buttons, which are all very clicky and satisfying. And then flipping the device over, on the back, you can see we've got a flash, an awful 0.3 megapixel camera, and the rear speaker grille. I'll talk more about the camera soon, but for now, here are some example photos. Now I think it's pretty obvious, but even by dumb phone standards, this camera is pretty abysmal. Finally, on the bottom, we've got a micro USB port for charging and data transfer. That's everything that comes in the box, plus a quick overview of the phone. Now though, I want to take a closer look into the hardware and build of this phone. My first impressions holding this phone was actually how big it is. It's not huge by modern standards, but it's nearly as tall as my iPhone 13 and much bigger than the original Nokia 6300. Taking a look at the phone itself, it's just this simple plastic construction all the way around. I wouldn't say it feels cheap though. In fact, with the battery installed, it actually has a pretty nice heft to it. It's not heavy, but it doesn't feel just like a lightweight, cheap piece of plastic either. Just for a bit of fun, I've tried to test this phone's durability by tossing it around a bit. It's held up just fine, although I get the feeling that larger drops would be more of a problem. The main way you'll interact with this phone is through its keypad and buttons, so I wanted to cover them too. Like I mentioned before, the buttons on this phone are all really clicky and tactile, which I think is great. Up front, there's 6 face buttons alongside a D-pad for navigating around the phone, and then underneath you've got the keypad for dialing and typing. My first impressions of the keypad and buttons are all pretty positive, but I have read some alarming things about this keypad deteriorating and double clicking after only a few months, which is pretty terrible. So far my keypad is fine, as it should be, but I'm going to keep an eye out on it for my full review. For now though, so far so good. Onto the camera, and it's awful. I wasn't expecting much, but this 0.3 megapixel camera really has nothing going for it. Here's also a side-by-side comparison with a few photos from my iPhone. This is, of course, an unfair comparison. My iPhone costs 10 times more than this phone, but I wanted you to know what you'd be giving up if you do choose to switch to a dumb phone like this Nokia. This awful camera really is a shame, since Nokia does include better cameras in some of their newer dumb phones. One tiny plus, I suppose, is that the camera flash is pretty bright and you can use it separately as a torch, which is handy to find things when it's dark. To wrap up this section on the phone's hardware, I wanted to take a look at call quality and battery life. Call quality is average. Nothing to complain about, although the audio isn't as crisp as it could be. I've tested this phone with someone else though, and they said they could hear me just fine on the other end. Battery life though is pretty solid. On standby, this phone sips power and loses less than 5% a day just laying around. Of course, it drains much quicker once you start using it for calls and texts. With extremely light usage though, I've managed to get a full week on a single charge. That's it for my hardware impressions. Overall, considering it's such a budget device, I'd say they're pretty positive. Of course, there are compromises, especially with the camera, but that's to be expected. Moving on though, I wanted to take a look at the software side of things on the Nokia 6300. I want to switch focus now and take you through this phone's software. The Nokia 6300 4G runs KaiOS, which includes its own app store with apps like Facebook, Google Maps, and WhatsApp available. Personally, I don't use WhatsApp, but I know it's crucial for many people, so it's good to see it available alongside other smart apps. Now I know smart apps is a huge feature, but you should know that they're not the same as iOS or Android apps. All the KaiOS apps I've tried are pretty stripped back and basic. For example, the Google Maps app can't give you live directions. Instead, it just shows you a basic overview of a route. I imagine many other smart apps are similar. Handy to have, but limited. Annoyingly, this phone also includes about 10 different bloatware apps and games, which you can't install without rooting your phone. They are truly just bloatware. They give you 3 to 5 free trials of the app or game and then ask you to pay. It's pretty gross, and I've included a link in this video's description which shows you how to root your phone and uninstall these bloatware apps if you're interested. Unfortunately, I've also just noticed some general software glitches when using this phone day to day. For example, I had to factory reset this phone just to get most of the stock apps to show up initially, and I've noticed a bit of lag just scrolling around this phone normally. It's nothing major, but it is annoying, and given that this phone was last updated a few years ago, I'm not expecting any fixes. On the plus side of things, most of the stock apps are simple and work well. There's all the basic apps for things like calls and texts, plus a clock app for alarms, a music player, a radio, a calculator, and more. Of course, you've also got access to a bunch more apps through the iOS App Store. This phone also supports predictive text, which does help speed up typing. It works pretty well, but annoyingly, there's no way to make it the default option. Every time you go to type something, you have to re-enable predictive text, which gets tiring pretty quickly. Despite its drawbacks though, I do think this phone actually offers a pretty solid software experience and level of customization. It's not great, but it's a lot more than you'll get on many other dumb phones. And it does give you some good options. If you're after a super dumbed down phone, you could ignore most of the apps and App Store and just use this Nokia for calls and texts. Alternatively though, if you do want more functionality, it's waiting there for you through those smart apps. Despite a few lags and glitches in the software, overall, like the hardware, my first impressions are still pretty solid. Overall, I'd say my first impressions with this phone have been pretty positive. The Nokia 6300 4G is clearly a budget device, but by no means a bad one. Sure, the camera is pretty crappy and the software has some quirks, but for $70, I'm not going to complain too loudly. Overall, I hope you enjoyed my first video on this channel and found it useful. If you did enjoy it, I'd love it if you could leave a like down below, and make sure to subscribe while you're there to see my full review of the Nokia 6300 4G when I release it. Thanks.